My name is Claire Adams. I am 32 years old and a payroll accountant for a logistics company in Ohio. At 4:30 in the morning, on a bitterly cold November day, my brother's children stood on my freezing porch in thin pajamas and whispered that their dad was sending them away. I missed the meeting that could have saved my career to protect them. But by sunrise, I would realize his cruel lie was about to destroy everything he had built. The wind was howling that night. It was the kind of harsh Ohio winter storm that rattled the window frames and made the old wooden floorboards of my house creak. I was sound asleep under a heavy quilt, resting my mind before the most important day of my professional life. My alarm was set for 5:30 in the morning. I needed to be at the office early to prepare the final documents for a massive corporate audit. Instead, I woke up an hour early to a sound that did not belong to the storm. It was a faint sound. It was rhythmic and desperate, like something small scratching against the heavy oak of my front door. I sat up in bed. My heart started pounding the way it always does when you are woken up in the middle of the night by something unexpected. I threw off the warm covers and stepped onto the cold hardwood floor. I pulled my thick robe around my shoulders and walked quietly down the hallway. I turned on the porch light and looked through the peephole. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. A blast of freezing wind hit my face, but I barely noticed the cold. Standing on my welcome mat covered in a light dusting of fresh snow were my niece and nephew. Emma was 8 years old. Leo was 6. They were wearing nothing but thin cotton pajamas. They did not have heavy winter coats. They did not have gloves. They did not even have shoes. They were standing barefoot on the freezing concrete of my porch. Emma was clutching her little brother tightly to her chest, trying to shield him from the biting wind. Leo was sobbing quietly with tears freezing on his pale cheeks. They were shivering so violently that their teeth were chattering in a loud, rhythmic clatter. I dropped to my knees immediately. I reached out and pulled both of them into my arms. Their skin was ice cold to the touch. It felt like holding 2 blocks of solid ice. Emma looked at me with eyes so full of absolute terror that it broke my heart. She grabbed the lapels of my robe with her freezing little fingers. Her voice was shaking so much I could barely understand her words at first. "Dad is packing his suitcase," she whispered between heavy sobs. "He woke us up and pushed us out the back door. He said he is sending us to an orphanage. Please, Aunt Claire, please do not take us back there. Do not let him send us away." I could not process the words. My brother Tyler was supposed to be the golden boy of our family. He was the successful wealth manager with the perfect suburban house and the beautiful wife, Amanda. The idea of him pushing his own children into a winter storm was incomprehensible, but the reality was standing right in front of me, shivering on my porch. I scooped Leo up into my arms. He was surprisingly light and completely stiff from the cold. I grabbed Emma by her tiny frozen hand and pulled her inside quickly. I slammed the front door shut against the howling wind and locked the deadbolt. The immediate priority was getting them warm. I carried Leo into the living room and set him gently on the sofa. I ran to the hall closet and pulled out the thickest fleece blankets I owned. I wrapped one tightly around Leo, making sure to cover his bare, freezing feet. I wrapped another one around Emma, who was standing in the middle of the room, looking around like she expected someone to jump out from the shadows and grab her. I rushed to the kitchen and turned on the stove to heat up some milk. My hands were shaking as I poured chocolate powder into 2 heavy ceramic mugs. I could hear Leo crying in the other room. It was not a loud tantrum. It was the quiet, broken weeping of a child who had been profoundly terrified by the people who were supposed to protect him. I brought the hot mugs into the living room. I knelt in front of the sofa and wrapped my hands around Emma's hands, helping her hold the warm cup. She took a tiny sip and closed her eyes. I rubbed her back, trying to generate some friction to warm her up. "Emma," I said softly, keeping my voice as calm as possible, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Where is your mother? Where is Amanda?" Emma shook her head. Her wet hair clung to her forehead. "Mom was not there," she whispered. "Dad was yelling on the phone. He was throwing clothes into a big black bag. He told us we were ruining his life. He unlocked the kitchen door and told us to go. He said if we came back, he would call the men from the orphanage to come lock us in a cage. We ran all the way here. They lived 4 blocks away within the same subdivision. Those two little children had run barefoot through the snow and ice in the pitch black of night because their father had convinced them they were about to be locked in a cage. The sheer psychological cruelty of it made my blood boil. A deep, unfamiliar rage sparked in my chest. I looked at the digital clock on the wall above my television. It was 5:15 in the morning. A cold wave of realization washed over me. At exactly 8 o'clock, I was supposed to be sitting in the main conference room of the logistics firm where I worked. I am a payroll accountant. For the past 3 weeks, I had been working 60-hour weeks, preparing a massive financial reconciliation for a corporate audit. Our company had recently lost a major distribution contract. The executives were looking for any excuse to downsize the accounting department. My boss, Mr. Davis, had made it very clear to me on Friday afternoon. He told me that this audit presentation was my one chance to prove my value to the firm. If the presentation went perfectly, my job would be secure. If I messed up, or if I failed to show up, I would be part of the upcoming layoffs. I needed that job. I live alone. I pay a mortgage. I just bought a reliable used car that requires monthly payments. I do not have a safety net. I do not have a wealthy partner to fall back on. My salary was the only thing keeping me afloat. I looked back down at Emma and Leo. Leo had finally stopped crying. He was curled into a tight ball under the heavy fleece blanket, holding his mug of hot chocolate against his chest for warmth. Emma was staring at me with wide, exhausted eyes. They looked so small and so incredibly fragile. I stood up and walked into the kitchen, out of their line of sight. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed Tyler's number. It rang 3 times and went straight to a generic voicemail. I ended the call and dialed Amanda's number. She was supposed to be the caring mother, but she had completely vanished. Her phone also went straight to voicemail. I leaned against the kitchen counter and pressed the palms of my hands against my tired eyes. The clock on the microwave read 5:30. I usually left my house at 6:30 to beat the morning traffic and get to the office with plenty of time to prepare the projector and hand out the financial binders. I had to make a decision. The rational, logical thing to do would be to call the police or Child Protective Services. I could hand the children over to the authorities, explain the situation, and then rush to my office to save my career. I walked back into the living room and knelt beside the sofa. "Emma," I said gently, "I think I need to call the police. We need to have some nice officers come here and figure out what your dad is doing." The reaction was instantaneous and horrifying. Emma dropped her mug. Hot chocolate spilled across my coffee table, but she did not care. She scrambled backward on the sofa, pulling Leo with her. She let out a sound that was half scream and half gasp. "No," she cried out. "No, Aunt Claire, please. Dad said the police take kids to the cages. Please do not let them take us. We will be good. We will be so quiet. Please do not make us go with strangers." Leo started wailing loudly, burying his face in his sister's shoulder. They were completely inconsolable. Tyler had clearly spent the night planting terrifying ideas in their heads, ensuring they would be too scared to ask anyone for official help. The psychological damage he had inflicted in just a few hours was staggering. If I called the police right now, uniformed officers would walk into my house and take these children away. The kids would be placed in the back of a squad car and driven to a sterile county facility while social workers tried to locate Tyler. They would be terrified. They would feel completely abandoned by the only person they had run to for safety. I looked at the clock. It was 6 in the morning. I sat down on the edge of the sofa. I reached out and gently pulled both children back into my arms. I rocked them slowly back and forth, ignoring the spilled hot chocolate on my rug. "I will not call the police," I promised them. "I am right here. I am not going anywhere, and I will not let anyone take you away. You are safe in my house. I promise you are completely safe." Emma buried her face in my neck. Her small body was still trembling, but she held on to me like I was her only lifeline in the world. I knew right then what I had to do. You cannot put a price tag on a child's sense of safety. You cannot look into the terrified eyes of a 6-year-old boy and tell him you have to leave him with strangers because you need to go to a corporate presentation. Family is supposed to mean something. Even if my brother had forgotten that I had not, I stayed on that sofa for 2 hours. I sat perfectly still as the sun slowly began to rise, casting a pale gray light through the living room windows. I watched Emma and Leo finally succumb to their exhaustion. They fell asleep tangled together under the thick blankets, breathing deeply. The clock on the wall moved relentlessly. 7 o'clock, 7:30, 7:45. Every minute that ticked by felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I knew exactly what was happening at the office. I knew Mr. Davis was walking into the conference room looking at my empty chair. I knew the external auditors were opening their laptops, waiting for the payroll files that only I could present. I knew the executives were exchanging annoyed glances. I held my phone in my hand, debating whether to send an email. But what could I possibly say that would excuse missing the most critical audit of the decade? A family emergency sounds like a convenient excuse to corporate directors who only care about profit margins. There was no email that could save me now. At 8 o'clock, I closed my eyes. The meeting had officially started. My career at the logistics firm was over. The sacrifice was made. I sat there listening to the steady breathing of my niece and nephew. I told myself I would find another job. I was a smart, capable accountant. I could update my resume. I could live frugally on my savings for a few months. It would be difficult, but I would survive. Protecting these children was the only choice I could live with. At exactly 8:15, my phone buzzed in my hand. I looked at the screen. The caller identification showed the main office number for my logistics firm. I took a deep breath, carefully slid my arm out from under Emma's sleeping head, and walked into the kitchen to answer the call. "Hello," I said softly, keeping my voice low so I would not wake the children. "Claire." The voice on the other end was cold and sharp. It was Mr. Davis, the financial director. His tone held absolutely no warmth and no patience. "Mr. Davis." "I am so sorry," I began, trying to find the right words. "I have a severe family emergency. My brother's children showed up at my house in the middle of the night. It is a crisis, and I could not leave them alone." "I am going to stop you right there, Claire," he interrupted. His voice was completely devoid of empathy. "I do not want to hear excuses. We have 3 external auditors sitting in my conference room right now. They are billing us by the hour. You assured me on Friday that your presentation was ready, and that you understood the absolute necessity of your attendance today." "I do understand, sir," I pleaded. "I have the files on my laptop. I can email them to you immediately. I just cannot physically be in the room today. I have 2 traumatized children in my living room." "This company is going through a massive restructuring," he said coldly. "We need people we can rely on when the pressure is high. If you cannot manage your personal life to ensure you are present for the most important audit of the year, then you are not the right fit for this department." "Mr. Davis, please," I said, feeling a knot of panic rise in my throat. "I have given 3 years of perfect attendance to this company. I worked weekends for the past month to prepare those files." "Your files are locked behind a password we do not have time to bypass," he snapped. "You have embarrassed this department and you have cost us invaluable time. We will be mailing your final paycheck and your severance paperwork to your home address by the end of the week. Do not bother coming back to the building. You are officially terminated effective immediately." The line went dead. The silence in my kitchen was deafening. I lowered the phone from my ear and set it on the granite countertop. My hands were shaking again, but this time it was not from the cold. It was from the sudden, crushing reality of my situation. I had just lost my sole source of income. I had no idea how I was going to pay my mortgage next month. I walked slowly back into the living room. Emma and Leo were still sleeping peacefully on the sofa, completely unaware of the massive price I had just paid to keep them safe. I looked at their small faces and I forced myself to take a deep breath. I had lost my job, but I had done the right thing. I thought the worst part of the morning was over. I thought the biggest crisis I would face today was figuring out my unemployment benefits. I had absolutely no idea that losing my job was only the beginning of the nightmare. I did not know that my brother Tyler had orchestrated this exact scenario. I did not know that he had deliberately pushed his children out into the freezing night specifically because he knew I would miss that audit. And I certainly did not know that the true reason he wanted me fired was hidden deep inside the digital files of the logistics firm I had just been terminated from. As I pulled a blanket over my own shoulders and sat in the armchair watching the children sleep, I prepared myself to confront Tyler. I expected him to be ashamed. I expected him to be apologetic. Instead, the real betrayal was about to walk right up to my front door. I sat in the heavy silence of my living room, staring at the blank screen of my phone. My career was gone. Years of late nights, skipped lunches, and perfect attendance had just evaporated in a single phone call. But as I listened to the soft, rhythmic breathing of Emma and Leo sleeping on my sofa, I told myself it was worth it. I had done what any decent human being would do. I had protected my family. At exactly 9 in the morning, a heavy, aggressive pounding shook my front door. It was not a normal knock. It was the loud, authoritative pounding of someone who demanded immediate entry. The sudden noise startled Leo. He whimpered in his sleep and curled tighter into a defensive ball under the fleece blanket. Emma jolted awake instantly. Her wide eyes darted around the room in absolute raw panic. I hushed her, gently pulling the blanket up to her chin. "Stay right here," I whispered, keeping my voice as soothing as possible. "I will handle it. Do not move." I walked down the hallway to the front door and looked through the brass peephole. Standing on my porch was my older brother Tyler. He was wearing a perfectly tailored gray wool coat over a crisp white button-down shirt. Not a single hair on his head was out of place. He looked every inch the successful wealth manager my mother always bragged about to her church friends. He looked affluent, responsible, and completely in control. Standing right next to him, looking stern and impatient, was a uniformed police officer. I unbolted the door and pulled it open. Before I could even speak a single word, Tyler launched into the performance of a lifetime. "Oh, thank God," Tyler gasped. He pushed past me into the narrow entryway, his voice cracking with brilliantly manufactured emotion. He looked back at the police officer with tears brimming in his eyes. "I told you, officer. I told you she had them here." The officer stepped inside, resting his hand near his utility belt. He looked at me with immediate hard suspicion. "Ma, am he?" said his voice echoing in the small space. "Are your niece and nephew inside this house?" "Yes," I said, keeping my posture straight and my voice calm. "They came to my door at 4:30 this morning. They were freezing and terrified. Tyler pushed them out of the house." Tyler let out a loud, dramatic sob. He covered his face with his hands, shaking his head as if he was entirely overwhelmed by my cruelty. "Claire, how could you say that?" he cried out. "How could you invent something so twisted and sick?" He turned back to the officer, his expression morphing into one of profound, exhausted sorrow. "Officer, my kids sleepwalk. Both of them have been doing it for months. It is a medical condition we have been desperately trying to manage. I woke up this morning to find the back door wide open, and their beds completely empty. I have been driving around the neighborhood for hours, losing my mind with worry. I thought they were dead." "That is an absolute lie," I said sharply, my protective instincts flaring up. "Emma told me everything. She told me you packed a bag. She told me you threatened to send them to an orphanage if they did not leave." Tyler looked at me with eyes full of fake, patronizing pity. The officer pulled out a small black notepad. "Sir," he asked, turning to Tyler, "has your sister exhibited this kind of erratic behavior before today?" Tyler sighed heavily, rubbing his temples like a man carrying the weight of the world. "Yes, officer. Look, I love my sister, but she has some deep psychological issues. She is 32 years old, she is single, and she lives completely alone. She has always been incredibly jealous of my marriage and my family. She has this ongoing delusion that my children belong to her. She must have found them wandering the freezing street during their sleepwalking episode and brought them here instead of calling me. She kept my terrified children away from their father for 5 hours just to play house." I stared at my brother in absolute horror. The sheer scale of his lie was breathtaking to witness. He was weaponizing my single status and twisting my protective instincts to paint me as an unstable, desperate kidnapper. He was standing in my foyer, dressed in designer wool, spinning a narrative that made him the tragic victim and made me the dangerous villain. "Officer," I pleaded, turning to the man in uniform. "You have to listen to me. Go look at them right now. They ran here barefoot in the snow. Their feet are bruised. They were hiding from him." The officer did not look at me. He looked at Tyler. Tyler was wealthy. Tyler was polished. Tyler was the very picture of suburban stability and success. The legal system looks at men like Tyler and sees credibility. The officer closed his notepad with a decisive snap. "Ma am." he said, his tone entirely devoid of warmth or understanding. "You kept 2 minor children for nearly 5 hours without notifying their legal guardian or the authorities. That is a very serious offense. I strongly suggest you cooperate and hand the children over immediately before I am forced to escalate this situation." Before I could argue, the sound of tires screeching in my driveway made us all turn our heads. The front door was still standing open. My mother, Patricia, rushed up the concrete walkway. She was clutching her designer handbag and wearing her expensive winter coat. Tyler must have called her to provide backup before he even called the police. Patricia burst into the hallway, pushing past the officer to grab Tyler by the arm. "Oh, my sweet boy," she cried, her voice thick with panic. "Are the children safe? Is everything okay?" "They are here, Mom," Tyler said, his voice trembling perfectly. Claire had them hidden here the whole time. My mother whipped her head around to face me. The profound relief on her face instantly hardened into pure, toxic venom. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. "What is wrong with you, Claire?" she shouted. "Why do you always want to ruin your brother's happiness?" "Mom," I said, stepping back from the sheer force of her anger. "He threw them out in the cold. Emma told me everything he did. He threatened them. Do not, you dare lie about my son." Patricia snapped, stepping closer until she was right in my face. "Tyler is a wonderful father. He is a successful businessman who provides everything for his perfect family. You are just a bitter, lonely woman who cannot stand to see him thrive." She looked me up and down, taking in my messy, uncombed hair and the wrinkled fleece robe I had been wearing since 4 in the morning. "Tyler told me what happened today," she sneered, her voice dropping to a cruel whisper. "You missed your big corporate audit, did you not? You just lost your job because of your own sheer irresponsibility. And now, because your own life is a miserable failure, you want to steal his children to make yourself feel important. You are pathetic, Claire. You have always been a disappointment." The words hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. My own mother was standing in my house using the job I had just sacrificed to protect her grandchildren as a weapon against me. She did not ask if the children were warm. She did not ask if they were hungry or hurt. She only cared about protecting the golden boy. She had spent her entire life shielding Tyler from the consequences of his actions, and she was doing it again right now. I looked past her at Tyler. He was standing behind our mother, looking at me over her shoulder. For one brief fraction of a second, the fake tears vanished completely. He gave me a cold, calculated smirk. He had orchestrated every single piece of this nightmare. He had made sure I would lose my job, and now he was making sure I lost my credibility with the police and our family. The police officer stepped between us, ending the argument. "Ma'am," he said, looking directly into my eyes. "Bring the children out right now, or I will have to place you under arrest for custodial interference." I had absolutely no choice. I walked on trembling legs into the living room. Leo was awake now, sitting up and clutching his sister's arm. Emma was staring at the doorway, her face completely pale and drained of blood. She had heard every word of the shouting in the hallway. I knelt down in front of them. My heart was breaking into 1,000 jagged pieces. "I am so sorry," I whispered, trying to keep my tears from falling. "You have to go with your dad right now. The police officer is here, and I cannot stop them from taking you." Leo started to cry, reaching out his small arms for me. Emma did not cry. She looked at me with a sudden fierce intensity that did not belong on the face of an 8-year-old girl. She stood up, pulling her little brother with her. I picked up her heavy winter coat that Tyler had brought inside from their house and wrapped it around her shoulders. As I reached forward to zip up the front, Emma leaned in close and pressed her face against my shoulder as if she was giving me a hug. Under the cover of her thick coat, I felt her tiny, freezing fingers slide something hard and rectangular deep into the pocket of my fleece robe. "Keep this," she whispered directly into my ear. Her voice so incredibly quiet that the police officer standing in the hallway could not possibly hear her. "Dad is looking for this everywhere. Do not let him find it." I stiffened completely, but I forced myself to nod against her shoulder. I stepped back and watched helplessly as the police officer escorted the 2 children out of my living room. Tyler scooped Leo into his arms, playing the part of the incredibly relieved and loving father perfectly. Patricia hovered around them out on the porch, fussing over Emma's hair and telling her everything was going to be fine. Tyler paused at the threshold before stepping out into the cold. He looked back at me standing completely alone in my living room. "You really should get some professional psychological help, Claire," he said, his voice dripping with fake public concern. "I hope you figure your life out." He turned around, and the heavy oak door slammed shut. The sound echoed violently through my empty house. I stood there in the absolute dead silence. In the span of just 4 hours, I had lost my career, my reliable income, my professional reputation, and my entire family. My mother had declared me a pathetic failure. My brother had nearly gotten me arrested and thrown in jail. I was completely isolated and financially ruined. I slowly reached my shaking hand into the deep pocket of my fleece robe. My fingers closed around cold metal and smooth glass. I pulled the object out into the light. It was an old iPad. The screen was cracked in the upper right corner, and the silver casing was heavily scratched. It was not a colorful device meant for a child. It was a heavy-duty professional tablet. As I stood there staring at it in the dim morning light of my hallway, the screen suddenly illuminated. The soft, digital glow cast pale shadows across my walls. A push notification slid smoothly across the lock screen. It was an automated alert from a secure banking application I did not recognize. The message contained a massive string of numbers and a single name that made my entire body go completely rigid. The silence left behind when the front door closed was heavy enough to crush my lungs. I stood perfectly still in the entryway of my house, staring at the wooden panels where my brother and my mother had just stood. A few minutes ago, the space had been filled with shouting accusations and the quiet, terrified weeping of 2 small children. Now there was nothing but the hum of my refrigerator and the howling wind outside. I walked slowly back into the living room. The fleece blankets were tangled on the sofa. The half-empty mug of hot chocolate sat on the coffee table with a thin film forming over the top. A dark stain marked the rug where Emma had dropped her cup in panic. Looking at that stain, the reality of my situation finally crashed down on me like a physical weight. I was 32 years old. I lived alone. I had a mortgage I could barely afford on a good day. And as of an hour ago, I was completely unemployed. I sank onto the cushions right where my niece and nephew had been sleeping. I pulled my knees to my chest. My mother's voice echoed in my head, calling me a pathetic disappointment. She had looked at me with such absolute disgust. For my entire life, I had played by the rules. I studied late into the night. I worked tedious jobs to pay my way through college. I built a quiet, honest life. Tyler had always been the one breaking the rules, taking shortcuts, and demanding praise for simply existing. Yet my mother had sprinted to his defense without a single second of hesitation. She did not care that Emma and Leo had run 4 blocks barefoot in the snow. She only cared that her golden boy was upset. A deep, suffocating wave of panic threatened to pull me under. I had no income. I had no savings to fall back on. My professional reputation in the local logistics industry was likely ruined. Mr. Davis was a vindictive man who would absolutely make sure every hiring manager in the county knew I had skipped a critical corporate audit without a valid excuse. My brother had nearly convinced a police officer to arrest me for custodial interference. I closed my eyes and took a long, shaking breath. I could not afford to fall apart. I had to focus. I reached into the deep pocket of my robe and pulled out the device Emma had secretly shoved into my hands. It was a heavy metallic tablet. The screen was badly cracked in the upper right corner, with spiderweb fractures running down the side. I ran my thumb over the cold glass. This was not a toy. It was an expensive, high-capacity device. When I pressed the power button, the screen flared to life, illuminating my dark living room. A push notification was sitting squarely in the center of the lock screen. It was an automated alert from a secure offshore banking application. The message simply read, "Margin call, warning account, liquidation imminent." My breath caught in my throat. I am a payroll accountant. I deal with numbers, ledgers, and financial software every single day. I know exactly what a margin call is. It is the desperate final warning a broker sends when an investor has borrowed, heavily lost a massive amount of money, and is about to have their entire account wiped out to cover the debts. Tyler was a wealth manager. He drove a luxury sports car. He lived in a sprawling 5-bedroom house with a manicured lawn. Amanda wore designer clothes and carried handbags that cost more than my car. They projected an image of absolute flawless financial success. So why was Tyler receiving an urgent liquidation warning from an offshore crypto exchange in the middle of the night? Emma's tiny, terrified voice whispered in my memory, "Dad is looking for this everywhere. Do not let him find it." I stared at the passcode screen. 6 blank circles waited for a number. Tyler was an arrogant man, but he was also deeply lazy. He believed he was smarter than everyone else, which meant he rarely put effort into covering his tracks. He relied on the people around him to clean up his messes. For his entire adult life, our mother Patricia had been his ultimate shield. She bailed him out of trouble, paid off his early credit card debts, and constantly reminded me that I needed to support my brother. I typed in the 2 digits for my mother's birth month, followed by the 2 digits for her birthday, and the last 2 digits of her birth year. The lock icon on the screen shook and turned green. The device unlocked instantly. A profound sense of disgust washed over me. He hid his most secretive financial device behind the birthday of the woman who enabled his toxic behavior. It was almost poetic. The home screen loaded. There were no games. There were no colorful applications for children to watch cartoons. The screen was filled entirely with encrypted file folders, spreadsheet applications, direct messaging platforms, and international trading software. I felt a strange shift happen inside my brain. The terrified, panicked sister who had just lost everything faded into the background. The professional auditor stepped forward. I wiped my damp eyes with the sleeve of my robe. I sat up straight on the sofa and opened the main file directory. I started digging. It took me less than 45 minutes to dismantle the illusion of my brother's entire life. The deeper I went into his digital files, the more horrified I became. Tyler was not a successful wealth manager. He was an absolute fraud. I found a master spreadsheet hidden under a generic title. It detailed his personal financial situation over the past 3 years. Tyler had not been managing wealth. He had been gambling it. He had taken massive unapproved loans using his home as collateral. He had funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into highly volatile cryptocurrency markets hoping to strike it rich overnight. For a while, the numbers showed he had been winning. The spreadsheet documented a period where he was up nearly $2 million. That must have been when he bought Amanda the luxury car and started paying for expensive country club memberships. But the crypto market is ruthless. When it crashed, Tyler refused to pull out. He doubled down. He borrowed more money on margin to cover his losses, betting everything on a recovery that never came. I scrolled through the columns of red numbers. The debt was staggering. He was millions of dollars in the hole. His credit lines were completely maxed out. I found a folder containing PDF copies of desperate emails he had sent to private lenders begging for extensions. I found late notices on his mortgage. The picture became crystal clear. This was the reason he was packing a black duffel bag at 4 a.m. He was not going on a business trip. He was preparing to run. The creditors were closing in on him. His perfect suburban life was entirely bankrupt. He woke his children up in the dead of night and pushed them out into the snow because they were liabilities. He and Amanda were planning to vanish before the authorities or the debt collectors could catch them, and they did not want to drag 2 young children along on the run. A cold shiver ran down my spine. My own brother was a monster. He had looked me right in the eye on my front porch, playing the role of a desperate loving father while his bags were packed for an international flight. But as I continued to scroll through the file directory, a new question formed in my mind. If Tyler was entirely broke, how was he affording plane tickets? How was he planning to survive on the run? A man with maxed out credit cards and multiple active margin calls cannot just disappear without a massive source of untraceable liquid cash. I backed out of the spreadsheet and opened his secure email application. I bypassed the secondary lock using the exact same birthday passcode. I began sorting his messages by date, focusing on the past 30 days. There were dozens of automated alerts from banks. There were angry messages from his legitimate clients asking why their portfolios were underperforming. But hidden among the noise, I found a series of emails from an encrypted server. The sender was listed only under a series of random letters. I opened the most recent message. It contained a list of wire transfer confirmations. The amounts were incredibly specific. $14,250. $18,900. $22,400. These were not crypto trades. These looked exactly like routine corporate vendor payments. I closed the email app and went back to the main file manager. I felt my pulse begin to race. There was a secondary drive on the iPad labeled with a single initial, the letter C. I tapped the folder. It asked for a 4-digit PIN. I thought about Tyler's arrogance. I typed in the year of his own birth. The folder opened. Inside was a subfolder titled C, a payroll. My initials are CA, Claire Adams. My breath caught in my throat again. I tapped the folder. It contained dozens of exported spreadsheet files. The file extensions were incredibly familiar to me. They were formatted exactly like the proprietary payroll and vendor software my logistics company used. I opened the first document. It was a master ledger of independent contractors. I zoomed in on the screen, reading the names of the limited liability companies listed in the rows. None of them were real logistics vendors. None of them provided trucking services, warehouse maintenance, or shipping materials. They were phantom companies, shell corporations created solely on paper. I looked at the routing numbers associated with each phantom vendor. I cross-referenced them with the wire transfers I had just seen in his encrypted email. They matched perfectly. I sat frozen on my living room sofa, holding the cracked iPad with both hands. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with such violent force that I felt physically dizzy. Tyler was not just a failed crypto gambler. He was actively laundering money, and he was not doing it through his own wealth management firm. He was running a vast continuous embezzlement scheme right through the accounts payable department of the logistics company where I worked. He was using my company. He was using my department. I pulled up the metadata on the fictitious vendor accounts. I checked the dates they were created in the system. They began exactly 6 months ago. That was precisely the same time our company upgraded its security software, allowing remote access for senior accounting staff. I had brought my work laptop to my mother's house for Sunday dinner once. Tyler had been there. He had asked to borrow my computer to check an urgent email because his phone was dead. I had unlocked it for him and stepped into the kitchen to help my mother with the dishes. He had not been checking an email. He had been installing a backdoor access program into my corporate payroll system. I stared at the screen as the horrifying truth washed over me. Tyler was siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars out of my employer's accounts to fund his escape plan. He had engineered the entire thing using my digital credentials. To any external auditor reviewing the server logs, it would look exactly like Claire Adams, the quiet 32-year-old payroll accountant, was the mastermind behind the embezzlement. That was why he did it today. That was why he pushed Emma and Leo out into the freezing storm at 4:30 in the morning. He knew I would take them in. He knew I would never abandon 2 terrified children to go to work. He knew I had the most critical audit of my career at 8 o'clock this morning. By forcing me to miss that meeting, he ensured 2 things. First, he ensured I would be fired immediately, locking me out of the corporate network before I could spot his fraudulent transactions during the audit presentation. Second, he perfectly framed me as a guilty employee fleeing the scene of a crime. When the auditors eventually discovered the missing funds later today, or early next week, they would see my empty desk. They would see that I abandoned my job on the exact day the books were being examined. They would look at the digital footprints tied to my name. I would not just be unemployed. I would be investigated by federal authorities for corporate fraud. My brother had not just ruined my morning. He had meticulously designed a trap to send me to federal prison while he took the stolen money and vanished across international borders. The screen of the iPad went dark, timing out to save battery. I saw my own reflection in the black glass. I looked terrified. I looked exhausted. I looked exactly like the pathetic victim my mother claimed I was. I slowly placed the iPad on the coffee table. I wiped my face. I took a deep breath of the cold morning air lingering in my house. The shock was beginning to fade. The panic was receding. In its place, a cold, brilliant clarity began to take root in my mind. Tyler thought I was a naive pushover. He thought I was just the quiet sister who always took the blame to keep the peace. He thought because he had stolen my job and weaponized my own family against me, that I would simply collapse and accept my fate. He had made a massive miscalculation. He had left behind the one piece of evidence that contained the entire blueprint of his operation. I stood up from the sofa. I walked into the kitchen and picked up my cell phone. I was not going to cry anymore. I was not going to hide. I was going to systematically dismantle my brother's life, and I was going to make sure the people who enabled him watched every single second of it happen. The screen of the cracked iPad seemed to burn into my retinas. I sat alone in my quiet living room, tracing the timeline of my own destruction. I needed to understand how the pieces fit together. I opened the calendar application on Tyler's device. There were no soccer practices or parent-teacher conferences listed. Instead, I found a color-coded schedule mapping out my own corporate deadlines. He had known. Tyler had known exactly when my company scheduled the external audits. He had marked the date in bright red digital ink. November 14th. Today. The day the external auditors were mandated to review the third quarter accounts payable ledgers. The exact same ledgers he had infected with his phantom vendor accounts. If I had walked into that conference room at 8 o'clock this morning, I would have opened those files on the projector. I would have seen the discrepancies immediately. I would have recognized that hundreds of thousands of dollars were being funneled into shell corporations. I would have stopped the audit, raised the alarm, and launched an internal investigation. Tyler knew my work ethic. He knew I was too meticulous to overlook a single misplaced decimal. He knew I would catch him, so he had to make sure I never made it to that meeting. He had to ensure I was completely locked out of the corporate network before the auditors could ask me a single question. The realization of how he accomplished this hit me with the force of a freight train. The early morning knock on my door was not an accident. It was not a sudden burst of bad parenting or a random moment of cruelty. It was a calculated, engineered crisis. Tyler had deliberately woken his own children in the freezing dark. He had packed a bag in front of them, knowing it would trigger their deepest anxieties. He had fed them horrifying lies about orphanages and cages to elevate their fear into absolute blind panic. And then he had intentionally unlocked the back door. He did not just throw them out. He aimed them like a weapon. He knew Emma was smart enough to navigate the 4 blocks to my house. He knew she would drag her little brother here because I was the only safe harbor they had ever known. More importantly, he knew my character. He knew with absolute certainty that I would never abandon 2 freezing, terrified children to go to a corporate presentation. He had weaponized my love for his children against me. He had used their trauma as a distraction. By the time I was sitting on the sofa, wrapping my shivering niece and nephew in fleece blankets, the corporate clock was ticking down to my termination. He sacrificed his children's sense of safety just to buy himself a 24-hour head start. The sheer sociopathy of his plan made my stomach churn. But if Tyler was willing to destroy his own sister and traumatize his own children, what else was he capable of doing to save himself? I went back to the main directory of the iPad. My hands were no longer shaking. A profound, icy calm had taken over my entire nervous system. I opened a folder labeled with our mother's initials, Patricia Ann. Our mother had stood in my hallway just a few hours ago. She had pointed her manicured finger at my chest and called me a pathetic failure. She had defended Tyler with the fierce, blind loyalty of a woman who believed her son could do no wrong. She had insulted my life, my career, and my character just to protect him from a situation he had completely fabricated. I tapped a digital document inside the folder. The header of the file displayed the logo of a prominent national bank. It was a commercial loan application. I scanned the paragraphs of dense legal text. Tyler had not just gambled away his own savings on volatile digital currency markets. He had quietly and systematically dismantled our mother's financial security. The document was a massive home equity line of credit. It was drawn directly against the white colonial house our mother had lived in for 30 years. The house my late father had worked his entire life to pay off, so she would always have a safe place to sleep. I looked at the signature line on the 3rd page. There was my mother's signature executed in blue digital ink. But I know my mother's handwriting. I have seen her sign thousands of birthday cards and grocery checks. The loops were wrong. The pressure was inconsistent. It was a meticulously crafted forgery. Right below the forged signature was an attached legal addendum. It was a power of attorney document giving Tyler absolute, unrestricted control over Patricia's real estate assets. The notary stamp on the document belonged to a man named David. A quick mental check reminded me that David was one of Tyler's old college friends. A man who currently worked at a local auto dealership and owed Tyler a massive amount of money. Tyler had forged a power of attorney using a compromised notary. He had then taken that fraudulent document to an online lending institution and leveraged the entire equity of our mother's fully paid-off home. I scrolled down to the final disbursement confirmation. $300,000. The money had been wired out of the equity account just 5 days ago. Tyler had extracted $300,000 in clean, untraceable cash from the very woman who had spent her morning defending him. He had stripped her of her only valuable asset. Within a few weeks, when the first massive loan payment was missed, the bank would send a default notice. Shortly after that, they would initiate foreclosure proceedings. Patricia would be evicted from her own home, and she would have absolutely no legal recourse because Tyler would be thousands of miles away. I opened the web browser on the iPad. The history had not been cleared. The most recent searches were for international banking regulations, non-extradition treaties, and offshore property rentals. The top search result was a booking confirmation from a private travel concierge. I clicked the link. The screen displayed a pair of first-class one-way tickets to Belize. The departure date was set for tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock. The passenger names were Tyler and Amanda. Amanda had not vanished this morning. She was probably sitting in a luxury hotel room right now, packing her designer luggage, while her husband finalized his scorched earth exit strategy. They were taking the embezzled payroll funds. They were taking the $300,000 stolen from our mother's house. And they were planning to leave Emma and Leo entirely behind. They intended to abandon the children with Patricia. They knew Patricia would take them in because it maintained her image as the perfect, devoted grandmother. But they also knew Patricia was about to lose her house and face complete financial ruin. Tyler was effectively condemning his own mother and his own children to a life of poverty and homelessness just to fund his tropical escape. I sat back against the cushions of my sofa. The silence of the house felt entirely different now. It was no longer the heavy silence of defeat. It was the sharp, charged silence of a battlefield just before the first shot is fired. I was holding a device packed with federal crimes. I had the fraudulent wire transfers. I had the forged power of attorney. I had the evidence of massive corporate embezzlement. The natural impulse of any rational person would be to pick up a phone, dial 911, and hand the entire digital nightmare over to the authorities. But I am an accountant. I am trained to look at the long-term variables and calculate the exact cost of every single action. If I called the local police right now, 2 patrol officers would arrive at my front door. They would not understand complex corporate financial fraud. They would see a disgruntled, recently fired employee holding a stolen device that belonged to her wealthy, successful brother. Tyler would be notified immediately. He would hire a ruthless defense attorney within 5 minutes. He would claim the iPad was stolen from his vehicle. He would claim the digital files had been planted by me to frame him for my own workplace incompetence. He would use the fact that I had just been terminated from the accounting department to prove I was the one manipulating the vendor accounts. Because I had missed the audit, my corporate access had already been revoked. I had no way to log into the logistics company servers to prove the phantom vendors were created from Tyler's external location. If Tyler managed to wipe the original accounts before the federal authorities could secure the servers, the entire narrative would flip. The money trail would point directly to my department. The stolen funds would be gone. Tyler would board his flight to Belize, and I would be the one facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary for corporate embezzlement. I could not act impulsively. Anger is a remarkably powerful fuel, but it is a terrible compass. I needed to be colder than Tyler. I needed to be more calculated than a man who would leave his own children freezing in the snow. I looked down at the forged mortgage document one more time. Tyler thought he had secured a flawless victory. He believed I was sitting in my house crying over my lost career. He believed our mother would blindly cover for him until the bank seized her home. He believed he was going to walk into his anniversary party tonight, clink champagne glasses with his wealthy friends, and then slip away into the night, a multimillionaire. He had built a spectacular house of cards. But he had forgotten one crucial detail. He had left the structural blueprints sitting right in my lap. I needed a trap. Not just a legal trap, but an inescapable public execution of his character. I needed to corner him in a space where he could not delete files, where he could not manipulate our mother, and where he could not spin a narrative to a sympathetic local cop. I needed the right audience, and I needed the right executioners. I set the iPad down on the table. I picked up my personal cell phone. I did not dial the police. Instead, I opened my contacts list and found the direct personal cell phone number of the man who had fired me just a few hours ago. It was time to make a phone call that would change the trajectory of this entire war. It was time to stop being the quiet, invisible sister and start being the architect of his absolute destruction. To catch a predator, you cannot act like a hunter. You have to play the prey. I sat alone in my quiet living room, staring at the cracked screen of the tablet, holding the absolute proof of my brother's crimes. I knew Tyler better than anyone else did. I knew his staggering narcissism, his unyielding arrogance, and his absolute need to feel superior to everyone around him. If he suspected for a single second that I was investigating his digital footprint, he would remotely wipe the corporate servers, empty his offshore accounts, and vanish across international borders before lunchtime. I had to feed his enormous ego. I had to give him exactly what he wanted to see. I walked down the hallway and stood in front of the full-length mirror. My eyes were bloodshot and swollen from the immense adrenaline crash of the morning. My hair was tangled and messy. I was still wearing the same wrinkled clothes I had thrown on at 4:30 in the morning. I looked completely exhausted, defeated, and broken. I looked like a woman who had just hit absolute rock bottom. It was the perfect disguise. I grabbed my car keys and drove my 10-year-old vehicle across town to the affluent suburb where my mother lived. Patricia's pristine, white colonial house sat behind a perfectly manicured winter lawn. It was a beautiful home, built on my late father's decades of hard work, now secretly mortgaged to the hilt by the golden boy sitting inside. I walked up the paved driveway holding my breath and forcing my hands to tremble. I knocked weakly on the heavy wooden door. It swung open almost immediately. Patricia blocked the threshold with her body. Her expression was a flawless masterclass in maternal disappointment and thinly veiled disgust. She looked me up and down, taking in my disheveled appearance with a harsh, judgmental glare. "What do you want, Claire?" she asked sharply, keeping her voice low so the neighbors would not hear. "Have you not caused enough damage for one morning? I cannot believe you would show your face here after trying to steal my grandchildren." I forced a heavy, pathetic sob into my throat. I let my shoulders slump forward and bowed my head, looking at her expensive winter boots. "Mom, please," I whimpered, allowing my voice to crack and break. "I need to talk to Tyler. I made a terrible mistake. I am so sorry." Patricia sighed heavily, a sound full of profound burden, but she stepped aside and gestured toward the kitchen. Tyler was sitting at the custom granite island. He looked incredibly comfortable and completely at ease. He was casually sipping coffee from a ceramic mug, scrolling through his phone like a man without a single care in the world. Emma and Leo were nowhere to be seen, probably banished to the upstairs guest bedroom so they would not ruin his peaceful morning. Tyler raised a single arrogant eyebrow as I approached the kitchen counter. "Well, Claire," he said, his voice dripping with smooth, practiced condescension. "I am honestly surprised you came here. I thought you would be busy packing your desk at the logistics firm." I fell apart completely. I let the tears flow freely down my face, hiding my face in my hands. I told him that losing my job had completely broken my mind. I said I was terrified of being a failure, and that seeing his children on my porch had made me project my own pathetic loneliness onto his perfect, successful family. I begged for his forgiveness. I told him he was absolutely right about my mental instability and my erratic behavior. I played the hysterical, desperate spinster so convincingly that it actually made my own stomach turn with revulsion. Tyler drank it up. He loved every single second of my humiliation. It validated every cruel thing he had ever believed about me. He stood up from the bar stool and walked around the granite island, placing a heavy, patronizing hand on my shaking shoulder. "I told you, Mom," he said, looking past me to Patricia with a tragic, sympathetic smile. "She is just sick. It is sad, really. We cannot be angry with her. She just needs help." He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored wool coat and pulled out a designer leather wallet. He extracted 2 crisp $100 bills and shoved them condescendingly into my trembling hand. "Here," he said smoothly, patting my shoulder one last time. "You do not have an income anymore, and I know you do not have any real savings. Buy yourself some groceries. And please, Claire, use the rest to find a good psychologist. You need serious professional help before you hurt yourself or someone else." I clutched the money like it was a vital lifeline. I thanked him profusely, wiping my face and nodding with extreme submission. Patricia warned me sternly not to contact the children again until I was medically cleared by a doctor. I promised I would stay away, and I slowly backed out of the house, keeping my head down the entire time. The moment the heavy front door clicked shut behind me, the tears stopped instantly. The pathetic, broken spinster vanished completely, leaving only the cold, calculating forensic accountant. I walked briskly back to my car with the $200 gripped tightly in my fist. I threw the bills onto the passenger seat and started the engine. Tyler had just funded his own execution. I did not drive back to my empty house. I drove straight to a quiet, independent coffee shop located exactly 2 blocks away from the headquarters of the logistics company that had just terminated my employment. I sat in a secluded corner booth facing the wall and opened my laptop. I connected the cracked iPad and quickly transferred the encrypted vendor ledgers, the phantom accounting profiles, and the offshore wire transfer records onto a highly secure flash drive. Then I picked up my phone and searched my contact list for the direct personal mobile number of Mr. Davis. He was the chief executive officer of the logistics firm, the man who had fired me over the phone just 3 hours earlier. The line rang twice before he answered. His tone was predictably hostile and incredibly brief. "Claire, I told you never to contact this office again," he snapped. "Your termination is final. If you are calling to beg for your position, I will hang up and notify building security." "Mr. Davis," I said, my voice completely devoid of the panic and desperation I had shown earlier that morning. "I did not call to ask for my job back. I called because your accounts payable department is currently being bled dry by a highly sophisticated corporate embezzlement ring. I have the internal routing numbers, the phantom vendor profiles, and the offshore destination accounts. If you hang up on me right now, the stolen money disappears forever. Meet me at the coffee shop on Elm Street in 10 minutes. Come alone." I ended the call before he could say another word. Mr. Davis arrived exactly 12 minutes later. He walked through the glass doors of the coffee shop looking deeply furious, but undeniably curious. He scanned the room, spotted me in the corner booth, and marched over. He slid into the vinyl seat across from me, crossing his arms over his chest. "This better not be a desperate stunt to save your career, Claire," he warned, his eyes narrowing. I did not waste a single second with pleasantries. I pushed my open laptop across the wooden table directly into his line of sight. I opened the master ledger I had extracted from the hidden folders. I showed him the list of fake logistics companies. I pointed out the exact timestamps matching the fraudulent wire transfers leaving the corporate accounts. I cross-referenced the payment dates with the fake invoices submitted to our internal servers. I watched the anger completely drain from his face, replaced by sheer absolute horror as he realized his company had lost hundreds of thousands of dollars right under his own nose. "Who did this?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, breathless whisper. "You were the lead payroll accountant. Are you confessing to committing federal corporate fraud? Look at the access logs and the network addresses," I replied, calmly tapping the screen. These massive transactions were executed remotely, using a sophisticated backdoor program installed on my digital credentials. The money was routed out of your system and deposited directly into an offshore holding account registered to my older brother Tyler. He engineered my absence this morning specifically so you would fire me, and immediately lock me out of the corporate network before I could sound the alarm during the audit. He framed me to cover his tracks and secure his escape. Mr. Davis leaned back heavily against the booth. The staggering reality of the situation hit him like a physical blow. He rubbed his face, taking a long, shaky breath. "I need to call the federal authorities right now," he said, reaching urgently for his cell phone resting on the table. "I need to get the police involved immediately." I stopped him. I placed my hand firmly over his hand, pressing the phone down against the wood. "If you call the authorities right now, Tyler will use his remote access to completely wipe the servers." I warned him, my voice dead serious. "He is actively monitoring the offshore accounts. The stolen money is currently sitting in a temporary holding trust. If he gets spooked by a sudden police investigation, he will instantly scatter the funds across dozens of untraceable international cryptocurrency wallets. You will never recover a single dime of your company money." Mr. Davis stared at me, his hand still resting under mine. "Then what exactly do you propose we do, Claire? How do we stop him?" "We let him think he won," I said softly. "We let him believe his brilliant plan worked perfectly, and that I took the fall." I pulled up the final set of highly classified documents I had decrypted from the iPad. It was the banking itinerary and the travel confirmations I had discovered earlier. Tyler took out a massive, fraudulent loan against our mother's fully paid-off house, I explained, pointing to the digital paperwork. $300,000 in stolen equity. He submitted an urgent request to withdraw the entire amount in physical, untraceable cash from a private bank vault this Friday afternoon. He needs that liquid currency to safely fund his life overseas without triggering international banking alerts. I turned the laptop screen slightly to show a glossy digital invitation featuring elegant gold cursive text. This Saturday night, Tyler and his wife Amanda are hosting a massive 10-year wedding anniversary party at the Oakmont Country Club. I told him, watching his eyes scan the details. He invited his wealthy asset management clients, his private investors, and our entire extended family. He plans to stand up in that room, play the perfect, devoted husband one last time, walk out with the duffel bag full of cash, and board a private one-way flight to Belize on Sunday morning. I looked Mr. Davis directly in the eyes, ensuring he understood the absolute gravity of the plan forming in my mind. "We do not catch him today," I said, my voice steady and resolute. "We wait until Saturday night. We let him gather every single person he is desperately trying to impress into one room. We trap him at the absolute height of his arrogance. We take back your stolen corporate money. We expose his massive financial fraud to his investors. And we make absolutely sure he has nowhere left to run." Once the chief executive officer left the coffee shop, I remained in the corner booth alone, with the hum of the espresso machine and the immense crushing weight of what we had just put into motion. We had a trap for the stolen money. We had the logistics company executives and federal authorities quietly aligning their crosshairs on my brother. But as I stared out the rain-streaked window, a sickening realization gripped my chest. Catching Tyler for embezzlement was only half the battle. If the federal authorities swooped in and arrested him and Amanda for massive corporate fraud, what exactly would happen to Emma and Leo? The answer terrified me to my very core. When parents are suddenly incarcerated, the state automatically steps in. The children would be immediately handed over to Child Protective Services. They would be thrust into the cold, chaotic machinery of the foster care system, terrified and confused. The authorities would naturally look for a next of kin to take them in. They would inevitably look to our mother, Patricia. But Tyler had already completely sabotaged that safety net. By forging her signature and extracting $300,000 from her home equity, he had guaranteed her impending financial ruin. Within a matter of weeks, Patricia would be facing aggressive foreclosure. She would be homeless, bankrupt, and entirely incapable of passing a basic home study for child placement. Tyler had effectively orphaned his own children. He was perfectly willing to let them become wards of the state while he sipped cocktails on a tropical beach. I refused to let those two innocent children become collateral damage in his sociopathic escape plan. I needed to move fast, and I needed a brilliant legal mind. I spent the next 2 hours making calls and exhausting my professional accounting network until a former colleague gave me a name: Sarah Hastings. She was a seasoned family law attorney with a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in the courtroom and deeply compassionate toward vulnerable children. She was notoriously expensive, but I took the $200 Tyler had thrown at me earlier that morning and combined it with the absolute last of my meager savings to secure an emergency consultation. I sat across from Sarah in her downtown office later that afternoon. She was a formidable woman in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Her office was lined with thick legal volumes and framed case victories, but her attention was entirely focused on me. She listened quietly as I laid out the complex web of the situation. I explained the 4:30 morning arrival of the freezing children, the fabricated sleepwalking story, the corporate embezzlement, and Tyler's imminent flight risk. Sarah leaned back in her heavy leather chair, folding her hands carefully together. "Claire," she said, her voice calm, but carrying immense authority. "Federal crimes and corporate theft belong to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My jurisdiction is the children. If you want to keep your niece and nephew out of the foster system, we need to prove to a family court judge that their biological parents present an immediate, severe, and irreversible danger to their well-being. We need concrete, undeniable proof of child abandonment and international flight." I opened my laptop and pulled up the encrypted files I had retrieved from Tyler's device. I did not just have simple flight records. I had the raw, unfiltered truth of how little my brother cared about his own flesh and blood. I showed Sarah the digital itinerary for 2 first-class one-way tickets to Belize, departing at 6 in the morning on Sunday. The passenger manifest listed only Tyler and Amanda. There were absolutely no tickets purchased for Emma or Leo. Then I opened the text message logs between my brother and his wife. The words glowing on the screen were so callously evil they made my stomach physically turn. Amanda had texted him complaining about the stress of the anniversary party preparations. She wrote that she could not wait to be done with this fake suburban nightmare once and for all. She specifically asked if he was sure his mother would not notice the kids were permanently hers until they were already in the air. Tyler had responded less than a minute later. His reply was permanently burned into my memory. He wrote that our mother was far too obsessed with keeping up appearances to let her precious grandchildren go to the state. He added that by the time the bank realized the mortgage was defaulted and moved to take the house, they would be completely untouchable in Central America. He told his wife to just smile for the cameras on Saturday night because it was their final performance. I watched Sarah read the messages. The seasoned attorney who had likely seen the darkest corners of human dysfunction pressed her lips into a tight, thin line. Her eyes flashed with absolute professional fury. "They are treating their own children like discarded luggage," she said, her tone dropping to an icy whisper. "They are deliberately abandoning them into a situation of guaranteed financial collapse just to facilitate a clean getaway. This is not just neglect, Claire. This is calculated, premeditated endangerment." Sarah did not waste another second. She immediately mobilized her entire legal team. For the next 48 hours, her office became a dedicated war room. We were fighting against a rapidly ticking clock. If we waited until Tyler was arrested on Saturday night to file for custody, it would be entirely too late. The system would automatically process the children as wards of the state during the chaos of the federal raid. We needed a preemptive legal strike. Sarah drafted an emergency ex parte custody petition. She explained that this is a rare and aggressive legal maneuver designed for extreme situations, where notifying the parents of the court filing would place the children in immediate danger or prompt the parents to flee the jurisdiction prematurely. We argued that Tyler and Amanda were an active flight risk engaged in massive federal fraud and demonstrating clear, premeditated child abandonment. We built a fortress of documentation. We attached the digital flight itineraries to Belize. We attached the text messages discussing the abandonment. We attached the forged home equity loan documents proving that the grandmother's house was about to be seized by the bank, rendering her entirely unfit for emergency placement. Finally, we attached a sworn affidavit from the logistics company executive confirming that federal authorities were actively preparing to intercept Tyler for severe corporate embezzlement. I sat in the mahogany waiting room of the family courthouse on Friday morning. My heart was pounding against my ribs while Sarah presented our mountain of evidence to a superior court judge behind closed doors. The minutes crawled by at an agonizing pace. I stared at the ticking hands of the wall clock, praying that the legal system would look past my single status, my sudden unemployment, and my small apartment. I prayed they would ignore the superficial optics and just look at the documented truth. I knew the courts generally favored placing children with wealthy married couples. Tyler had built an entire life based on projecting that exact image of stability. But the paper trail I had meticulously uncovered proved that his stability was nothing but a hollow, predatory illusion. When the heavy wooden doors of the chambers finally opened, Sarah walked out holding a thick stack of papers stamped with official court seals. She did not smile, but the fierce, determined look in her eyes told me absolutely everything I needed to know. The judge signed the order, Sarah said, handing me the top document. "It is a temporary emergency custody mandate. As of this exact second, you have full physical and legal custody of Emma and Leo. If Tyler or Amanda attempt to remove those children from your care or from Patricia's house, they will be charged with federal kidnapping." I looked down at the paper. My name was printed clearly under the designation of legal guardian. A massive, overwhelming wave of relief washed over my entire body. My knees felt weak, but I stood my ground. The children were completely safe. No matter what happened when the walls came crashing down around Tyler, the state could not touch Emma and Leo. They belonged with me. They would never have to stand freezing on a porch in the middle of the night ever again. The final pieces of the board were now perfectly aligned. The trap was fully constructed, and the steel jaws were ready to snap shut. By Saturday afternoon, the entire operation was moving in absolute synchronized silence. The corporate executives had coordinated with their attorneys and the local branch of the federal authorities. Federal agents were actively monitoring Tyler's offshore holding accounts, ready to freeze the assets the very second he tried to initiate a transfer. The local police department had been briefed on the emergency custody order, ensuring there would be no legal confusion when the inevitable chaos erupted. I stood in my bedroom, staring at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The pathetic, crying spinster who had begged for grocery money in my mother's kitchen was completely gone. In her place stood a woman who had meticulously dismantled a sociopath's master plan piece by piece. I dressed for war. I pulled my dark navy-tailored suit from the back of the closet. It was the exact suit I usually reserved for high-stakes corporate audits, the armor I wore when I needed to command a room filled with hostile executives. I ironed my white blouse and fastened my hair into a sharp professional bun. I slipped the official court-stamped emergency custody order into a thick leather portfolio alongside the printed evidence of the phantom vendor ledgers, the forged mortgage documents, and the damning text messages. I checked the time on my watch. It was exactly 7:00 in the evening. The Oakmont Country Club was a beacon of old money and exclusive privilege. It sat on a sprawling green estate surrounded by towering ancient oak trees and heavy wrought iron gates. Tonight, it was hosting the grand 10-year wedding anniversary celebration of Tyler and Amanda. The golden boy and his perfect wife were currently inside sipping expensive champagne, smiling for the cameras, and accepting the admiration of 50 wealthy guests. They believed they were hours away from a perfect escape. They believed I was sitting alone in my dark house, utterly defeated and financially ruined. They believed their carefully constructed lies had protected them from any possible consequences. I picked up my car keys and walked out the front door. The rain had stopped, leaving the evening air crisp and sharply cold. I got into my reliable vehicle and pulled out of the driveway, heading straight for the country club. I was carrying the full weight of federal crime's financial ruin and absolute, undeniable justice in the passenger seat beside me. It was finally time to walk out of the shadows and make the villain pay the ultimate price. The Oakmont Country Club glowed against the dark November sky like an impenetrable fortress of old money and untouchable privilege. I guided my 10-year-old Honda Civic up the sweeping, circular driveway, feeling the tires crunch slightly against the remaining patches of morning ice. I pulled up to the grand entrance and shifted the car into park. I handed my keys to a young valet attendant who looked deeply confused by the presence of my modest vehicle, surrounded by a sea of sleek black Mercedes and imported sports cars. I did not offer him an explanation or an apology. I simply stepped out into the frigid night air and pulled my tailored navy blue suit jacket tight against the biting wind. I stood at the bottom of the grand stone staircase for a long moment. I looked up at the massive illuminated windows of the main banquet hall. Somewhere inside that beautiful building, my brother was celebrating a decade of marriage using stolen money. He was sipping imported champagne paid for by phantom corporate vendor accounts. He was feeding his wealthy friends with the stolen equity of our mother's fully paid-off house. He believed he was completely invincible. He believed he had successfully orchestrated my professional ruin and secured his flawless tropical escape. I took a deep breath of the freezing air, letting it fill my lungs and sharpen my focus. I was not the terrified, exhausted woman who had huddled on a sofa at 4:30 in the morning. I was a highly trained forensic accountant, holding a portfolio packed with undeniable federal evidence. I walked up the stone steps with my head held high. The heavy brass and glass doors of the club swung open automatically, revealing a magnificent foyer drenched in the warm, golden light of cascading crystal chandeliers. The air inside smelled of expensive floral arrangements, roasted meats, and the heavy, musky scent of high-end designer perfumes. I walked past the mahogany reception desk, completely ignoring the hostess who tried to ask for my invitation. I knew exactly where the grand ballroom was located. The double doors leading into the main event space were propped wide open. I stepped into the shadowed alcove just outside the threshold and paused to observe the magnificent spectacle my brother had built on a foundation of absolute fraud. The room was a breathtaking display of suburban excess. There were exactly 50 guests seated at round tables draped in pristine white linen. Massive, elaborate centerpieces of imported white roses and silver willow branches stretched toward the high ceiling. Waiters in crisp black vests circulated silently among the tables, pouring vintage wine into crystal flutes and clearing away silver appetizer plates. I scanned the faces in the crowd. I recognized almost everyone. There were prominent private investors Tyler had been aggressively courting for his wealth management firm. There were commercial real estate developers who trusted him with their massive portfolios. There were Amanda's high society friends wearing custom cocktail dresses and glittering diamond jewelry, and sitting at the primary VIP table, placed directly next to the small stage, was our mother Patricia. She was wearing a brand new burgundy sequined evening gown, beaming with absolute glowing pride. She was laughing brightly with a wealthy investor sitting beside her, looking like a queen surveying her perfect kingdom. She looked completely joyful and entirely unaware that the very son she was admiring had secretly forged her signature-stolen $300,000 from her home equity and practically guaranteed her imminent eviction and homelessness. My attention shifted to the front of the room. Tyler was standing at the head of the main banquet table, holding a microphone in his right hand and a tall flute of champagne in his left. He looked like the absolute pinnacle of the modern American dream. He wore a custom-tailored black tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. Amanda stood close by his side, wearing a stunning white silk dress, looking adoringly up at her husband. Tyler gently tapped a silver spoon against his crystal glass. The bright, ringing sound cut through the ambient chatter, and the entire room instantly fell into a respectful hush. I stood perfectly still in the dim hallway, listening to the man who had deliberately pushed his freezing barefoot children out into a winter storm speak eloquently about the sanctity of family, "Thank you all for being here with us tonight," Tyler said, his deep voice echoing smoothly through the ballroom sound system. 10 years ago, I stood at an altar and promised to love and protect my beautiful wife, Amanda. We started our journey with nothing but a shared vision and a commitment to hard work. Building my wealth management firm from the ground up was not an easy task. It required incredibly long hours, immense personal sacrifice, and above all, an unwavering dedication to absolute integrity in every single business dealing. He paused, perfectly timing his delivery to let the wealthy investors in the room nod in solemn agreement. But the true foundation of my success has always been my family. Tyler continued, placing his hand gently over his heart. My wonderful mother, Patricia, taught me early on that true wealth is not measured by the numbers in a bank account. It is measured by the people you protect and the fierce loyalty you honor. We have faced our share of challenges, but we always put our family first. I raise my glass tonight to honesty, to a lasting legacy, and to the people we love the most. The ballroom erupted into enthusiastic, elegant applause. Patricia wiped a proud, shimmering tear from her cheek. Amanda leaned in and kissed Tyler softly on the cheek. The sheer, staggering hypocrisy of his words tasted like bitter ash in my mouth. My pulse beat a slow, steady rhythm in my ears. I adjusted my firm grip on the thick leather portfolio tucked securely under my arm. I stepped out of the shadows of the hallway and walked directly through the open double doors into the brilliant, blinding light of the grand ballroom. I did not run. I did not march aggressively. I walked with the slow, measured, deliberate steps of a corporate auditor who had just found the fatal, unexplainable discrepancy in a hidden ledger. My low heels clicked sharply against the polished hardwood floor. At first, only the guests seated at the tables near the back of the room noticed my arrival. A few heads turned in my direction. Quiet conversations stuttered and died out. Then the heavy silence began to ripple forward through the massive room, like a physical wave rolling over the crowd. The string quartet playing softly on a small platform in the corner faltered, lost their rhythm, and slowly stopped playing altogether. By the time I reached the precise center of the ballroom, 50 pairs of eyes were completely locked onto me. I was a jarring visual disruption in their flawless, expensive evening. I was not wearing a sparkling evening gown or designer jewelry. I was wearing corporate armor, and my face was entirely devoid of a smile. Patricia spotted me from her prime seat at the VIP table. The proud, tearful maternal smile completely vanished from her face. It was replaced instantly by a mask of sheer, panicked outrage. She pushed her heavy wooden chair back, scraping it loudly against the floor, and rushed forward to intercept my path before I could reach the front of the room. She grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured fingers digging painfully into the wool fabric of my navy suit sleeve. "Claire!" she hissed, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper, meant only for my ears. What on earth do you think you are doing here? You were explicitly not invited to this celebration. Are you completely out of your mind? I looked down at her hand gripping my arm, and then I looked directly into her furious blue eyes. My voice was perfectly calm, and completely devoid of the quiet submission she was so used to hearing from me. Let go of my arm, Patricia, I said. She blinked rapidly, entirely caught off guard by my cold, authoritative tone. But she did not let go. She leaned in closer, her face flushed with dark red anger. You are going to turn around right now and walk out those doors, she commanded fiercely. You are not going to ruin your brother's perfect night because you are having another pathetic mental breakdown. I told you to go see a psychologist and get medication. Security will physically throw you out into the street if you cause a scene in front of these important people. You are entirely welcome to call them, I replied smoothly, holding her angry gaze without flinching. But I promise you they will not be escorting me out of this building today. I gently but firmly placed my hand over hers and peeled her tight fingers off my sleeve. I stepped deliberately around her, leaving her standing completely frozen and speechless in the middle of the center aisle. I continued my slow, measured walk toward the head table. Amanda had taken a nervous step backward, her eyes wide with sudden apprehension. Tyler stood perfectly still behind the table. His microphone was lowered to his side, and his champagne glass was suspended in mid-air. He tried desperately to maintain his confident, wealthy facade, but I could see the tiny, subtle fractures forming in his composure. I knew exactly what he was thinking. He was rapidly calculating the variables in his head. He assumed I was a broken, desperate woman who had come to beg for my accounting job back or to scream wildly about the unfairness of my miserable life. He fully expected a hysterical, emotional outburst that he could easily dismiss to his investors as the sad ramblings of an unstable, jealous sister. I did not give him a hysterical outburst. I gave him a silent corporate execution. I reached the main banquet table, stopping just 2 feet away from him. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout or hurl insults. I looked directly into his eyes and spoke clearly, projecting my words so the absolute dead silence of the room would carry them to every single investor family member and friend seated at the surrounding tables. I brought a commemorative gift for your anniversary, Tyler, I said, my voice perfectly steady and freezing cold. I unzipped the top of my heavy leather portfolio. I reached inside and pulled out 2 massive bound stacks of thick legal and financial documents. I lifted them up and placed them deliberately and forcefully onto the crisp white tablecloth right next to his plate of expensive catered food. The heavy, dull thud of the paper hitting the solid wood table echoed loudly in the quiet room. The top pages of the documents were not hidden inside manila folders or obscured by cover sheets. They were facing entirely upward directly under the bright illumination of the overhead chandelier light. The first stack displayed the highly recognizable bold blue corporate logo of the commercial logistics company that had terminated my employment just 2 days ago. Right beneath that large blue logo were hundreds of printed rows of phantom vendor accounts, fraudulent routing numbers, and unauthorized offshore wire transfer authorizations. The second stack of papers bore the elegant golden emblem of the National Bank where our mother had held her mortgage for 30 years. It proudly displayed the fraudulent home equity loan documents, the forged power of attorney signature, and the undeniable $300,000 withdrawal confirmation routing directly to a shell account. Tyler looked down at the table. I watched his eyes lock onto the bright blue logistics company logo and then dart frantically to the golden banking emblem. The transformation in his physical appearance was instantaneous and absolute. The arrogant, superior smile that had rested comfortably on his face for his entire adult life simply vanished. It was completely wiped away in a fraction of a second, replaced by a look of stark, primal, unadulterated terror. He realized in that exact moment that I had not been defeated. He realized I had cracked his secure digital vault. He knew with absolute horrifying certainty that I possessed the master blueprint of his massive federal embezzlement scheme and his calculated real estate fraud. All the healthy color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. A thick, heavy bead of sweat formed at his temple and slowly traced its way down the side of his rigid jawline. His hands began to tremble so violently that the expensive champagne in his crystal flute splashed wildly over the rim and dripped down onto his polished tuxedo shoes. He opened his mouth to speak. He desperately wanted to spin a lie to charm the crowd to defend himself to his investors, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He stood there suffocating on his own collapsing narrative. No sound came out. The entire ballroom fell into a suffocating, deathly silence. Nobody moved an inch. Nobody whispered a single word. 50 wealthy, powerful, connected people sat perfectly still, staring at the golden boy who was suddenly sweating, shaking, and completely paralyzed in front of 2 stacks of ordinary paper. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom was so profound that I could hear the faint hum of the heating vents above us. Tyler was completely paralyzed. His knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the banquet table, leaning his weight forward, just to keep his knees from buckling. I did not give him a chance to recover. I turned my back on my brother and faced the sea of wealthy investors, socialites, and extended family members, who were still sitting frozen in their chairs. I looked directly at a table near the front where 3 of Tyler's most prominent clients were seated. I knew them by reputation. They were older men who had spent decades building their commercial real estate portfolios, only to hand their hard-earned wealth over to my brother for management. My brother has spent the last 30 minutes talking to you about integrity and family values, I said, projecting my voice clearly across the room. I think you deserve to know exactly how he funds his luxurious lifestyle. Tyler is not a successful wealth manager. He is entirely bankrupt. He lost millions of dollars gambling on volatile offshore cryptocurrency markets. When his margin calls came due, he did not cut his losses. He started stealing. A loud collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The wealthy investor sitting closest to the stage suddenly stood up. His face was flushed with immediate panic. He pointed a trembling finger at Tyler and demanded to know if his retirement funds were safe. Tyler opened his mouth, but he was completely suffocated by his own panic. He could only stare back with wide, terrified eyes. Tyler needed a massive influx of untraceable cash to cover his tracks and fund his escape. I continued making sure every single person in the room could hear the absolute truth. So he installed a digital backdoor into the accounting servers of the logistics firm, where I worked as a payroll manager. He generated phantom vendor profiles. He created fake trucking companies and maintenance services on paper. Then he authorized hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent wire transfers, routing my company cash directly into his own hidden offshore accounts. He used my digital credentials to do it, so that when the external auditors found the missing money, I would be the one going to federal prison. A man in a sharp black suit stepped out from the shadows near the entrance of the ballroom. It was Mr. Davis, the chief executive officer of my former logistics firm. He walked slowly down the center aisle, his presence demanding immediate respect from every corporate professional in the room.
"She is telling the absolute truth,"
Mr. Davis said, his deep, authoritative voice cutting through the rising murmurs of the crowd. Our internal security team spent the entire afternoon tearing apart the server logs. We tracked the fraudulent routing numbers directly to offshore shell corporations registered under Tyler Adams. He stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from my company, and he actively framed one of my most dedicated employees to guarantee his getaway. The entire room erupted into chaos. High society friends began whispering frantically to each other. Investors pulled out their cellular phones, frantically dialing their private bankers and legal teams. The facade of the golden boy was shattering into a million irreparable pieces right in front of their eyes. But there was one person in the room who absolutely refused to accept the reality unfolding before her. My mother, Patricia, shoved her chair backwards so violently that it toppled over and hit the hardwood floor with a loud crack. She marched right up to the head table, placing her body between me and Tyler like a human shield. Her face was distorted with a desperate, ferocious denial. "Stop it!" she screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You are making all of this up. You printed out fake documents to ruin your brother because you are a miserable, jealous failure. Tyler would never do something like this. He is a good man. He is a provider. You are just trying to destroy this beautiful anniversary party because no one has ever loved you enough to throw you one." I looked at the woman who had spent my entire childhood treating me like an unwanted burden. I felt absolutely no anger toward her anymore. I only felt a deep, clinical pity. "I am not trying to destroy him, Mom," I said quietly. "He already did that himself. I am just providing the documentation. I reached past her and picked up the second stack of papers from the table. I lifted the heavy commercial loan agreement, the one bearing the golden emblem of her personal bank. I held it up so the bright chandelier light illuminated the dark ink on the signature line. "You think your son is a good provider?" I asked, my voice perfectly steady. "Mom, I want you to look very closely at this signature." I handed the document directly to her. Patricia snatched the paper from my hands, glaring at me with pure hatred before looking down at the text. I watched her eyes scan the legal terminology. I watched her gaze travel down to the bottom of the third page, where her own name was written in blue ink. "That is not my signature," she stammered, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. "The loops are completely wrong. I never signed a commercial loan document. My house has been completely paid off for 10 years. It was paid off," I corrected her. "But Tyler needed untraceable cash. He took your original property deed and used a compromised notary to forge a power of attorney. He went to an online lending institution and took out a massive home equity line of credit using your fully owned house as his absolute personal collateral." Patricia physically recoiled as if the piece of paper had suddenly burned her hands. She looked back at Tyler, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "Tyler, what is she talking about?" Patricia pleaded, her voice trembling with the first undeniable wave of true terror. "Tell her she is lying. Tell them all she is lying." Tyler could not look his mother in the eye. He stared down at his expensive, polished shoes, perfectly silent. His absolute refusal to deny the accusation was the most damning confession in the world. "He extracted $300,000 from your home equity 5 days ago." I told her, my voice echoing in the horrified silence of the ballroom. "He routed the cash to a private holding vault. He has no intention of making a single monthly payment on that massive loan. Next week, the bank will recognize the default. Next month, they will send the foreclosure notices. They are going to seize the house you have lived in for 30 years. You are going to be evicted, and you are going to be left completely homeless." Patricia dropped the papers. They fluttered to the hardwood floor, landing right next to Tyler's feet. Her hands flew to her mouth to stifle a gut-wrenching sob. The woman who had proudly bragged about her wealthy son all evening was suddenly realizing she had been nothing but a convenient asset for him to completely drain. But why she whispered, tears finally spilling over her carefully applied makeup. "Why would you take my house, Tyler? Where were you going to go?" "Because he is a coward," I answered for him. I reached into my leather portfolio one final time and pulled out the printed digital itinerary. I held up the brightly colored flight confirmation for the entire room to see. "Because Tyler and his lovely wife Amanda booked 2 first-class one-way tickets to Belize," I announced loudly. "Their flight departs from the international terminal tomorrow morning at exactly 6:00 the clock. They were going to leave this anniversary party, collect the $300,000 in stolen cash, and vanish into a country with favorable banking privacy laws." I turned my attention to Amanda. The beautiful, glowing wife in the stunning white silk dress was standing completely frozen behind the banquet table. Her perfect smile had entirely melted away, leaving a look of pure, trapped panic. "They were going to leave you holding the bag for a massive federal loan default, Mom," I said, keeping my eyes locked on Amanda. "But that is not the most despicable part of their plan. The most terrifying thing your golden boy did was decide that his own children were simply too heavy to carry on the run." I heard several guests in the room gasp out loud. A wealthy woman near the front row covered her mouth in shock. Tyler and Amanda did not purchase a ticket for Emma. They did not purchase a ticket for Leo. I continued, my voice rising with righteous, unwavering conviction. They decided to abandon their own young children. Tyler deliberately woke them up at 4:30 in the morning. He terrified them with stories about cages and orphanages. He intentionally pushed those freezing children out into the snow, knowing they would run directly to my house. He sacrificed his children just to create a distraction, ensuring I would miss my corporate audit and take the fall for his embezzlement. He planned to leave his own flesh and blood completely behind, while he lived like a king on a tropical beach. The social atmosphere in the ballroom instantly shattered. The polite murmurs completely vanished, replaced by loud, aggressive shouting. Wealthy investors were openly cursing at Tyler, calling him a fraud and a thief. High society women who had spent the entire evening complimenting Amanda were now staring at her with absolute naked revulsion. The perfect, flawless image Tyler had spent a decade building was completely incinerated in a matter of seconds. People began grabbing their coats and marching toward the exit doors. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a sinking ship. They wanted to get as far away from the impending federal fallout as humanly possible. Amanda finally snapped. The realization that she was about to lose her luxury lifestyle, her social standing, and her freedom completely broke her mind. She turned on her husband like a cornered animal. "This is your fault," she screamed violently, shoving Tyler in the chest with both hands. "You told me it was handled. You promised me she was too stupid to figure out the server logs. You promised me we were going to be on that beach by tomorrow afternoon." "Amanda," Patricia gasped, stepping away from her daughter-in-law as if she were toxic. You knew he stole my house and you were going to leave the babies behind." "He made me do it!" Amanda shrieked hysterically, tears of selfish panic streaming down her face. She backed away from the table, pointing an accusing finger at Tyler. "He said the kids would ruin the escape plan. He said his mother was too proud to let them go to the state." "I did not want to steal your house, Patricia. I just wanted my life back. He ruined everything." Tyler finally found his voice. It was not the smooth, charismatic tone of a successful wealth manager. It was the harsh, desperate snarl of a cornered predator.
"Shut your mouth, you selfish parasite,"
he roared, lunging toward his wife with his hands balled into tight fists. "You loved the money. You spent $50,000 of those corporate funds on luxury vacations and designer clothes in the last 3 months alone. You helped me pack the bags. You wanted to leave the kids just as much as I did, so do not stand there and play the innocent victim." Their perfect 10-year marriage disintegrated into a vicious screaming match right in front of the horrified remaining guests. They were violently tearing each other apart, desperately trying to assign blame, as the walls completely caved in around them. I stood calmly near the banquet table, watching the absolute destruction of the people who had tried to destroy me. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace settling into my bones. Dr. Hayes had been right. This was not revenge. This was simply accountability arriving exactly on time. Tyler suddenly stopped screaming at his wife. He turned his head and locked his furious, bloodshot eyes onto me. The sheer, unadulterated hatred radiating from his face was genuinely terrifying. His primal flight or fight response had fully kicked in. He realized that the life he had built was completely over. He realized the offshore accounts were likely already frozen by federal authorities. The tropical escape plan was utterly dead, and he realized that the only physical evidence immediately tying him to the corporate fraud was sitting right in front of him on the white linen tablecloth. "You ruined my life!" he screamed, a horrifying guttural sound that tore through his throat. Tyler lunged forward. He cleared the space between us with terrifying speed, his hands reaching aggressively for the stacks of printed financial ledgers and the forged banking documents. He intended to rip the papers to shreds. He intended to violently tear the leather portfolio right out of my hands and destroy the evidence before anyone could stop him. I braced myself for the physical impact, planting my feet firmly on the hardwood floor, but I did not step backward. I knew I did not have to fight him. Before Tyler's outstretched hands could even touch the stack of papers, a massive, deafening crash echoed through the room. The heavy, double oak doors of the grand ballroom violently burst open, slamming hard against the interior walls. It was not the country club manager coming to ask us to keep the noise down. It was a highly coordinated tactical entry. A dozen men and women wearing dark tactical gear, heavy protective vests, and holstered weapons stormed directly into the room. The gold letters printed across the back of their tactical jackets gleamed brightly under the crystal chandeliers. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Right beside them, moving with fast, aggressive precision, were uniformed officers from the state police department. The sheer force of the heavy oak doors flying open shook the crystal chandeliers hanging above us. Men and women in dark tactical vests flooded the grand ballroom of the Oakmont Country Club. The bright yellow letters across their backs spelled out federal agents in stark contrast to the pristine white floral arrangements and vintage champagne flutes. State police officers flanked them, moving with a terrifying coordinated efficiency that instantly completely swallowed the room. The high society guests scattered like frightened birds. Wealthy investors dropped their crystal glasses and backed away from the main banquet table. Nobody wanted to be caught in the blast radius of a federal raid. Tyler remained frozen at the head of the table. The man who had spent his entire life projecting an aura of untouchable superiority now looked completely hollowed out. His broad shoulders collapsed. His expensive, custom-tailored tuxedo suddenly looked like a stolen costume. The lead federal agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a completely unreadable expression, marched directly down the center aisle. He bypassed the terrified guests and locked his gaze entirely on my brother. Before the agent could even speak, Mr. Davis stepped out from the cluster of stunned investors. The chief executive officer of my former logistics company walked toward the head table with his hands clasped behind his back. He did not look angry anymore. He looked like a man who had successfully exterminated a deadly parasite. "The police have been monitoring your offshore accounts for 3 days, Tyler," he said, his deep voice carrying flawlessly across the silent ballroom. "We watched you attempt to route the stolen payroll funds through the Cayman Islands this morning. We watched the massive transactions bounce directly into a frozen federal holding trust. You did not outsmart anyone. You simply built your own permanent prison cell." Tyler opened his mouth, but his vocal cords were completely paralyzed. He looked from Mr. Davis to the federal agents, and then finally over to me. The absolute pure desperation in his eyes was staggering. He was a man watching his entire meticulously crafted universe burn to the ground in a matter of seconds. "Tyler Adams," the lead federal agent stated loudly, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "I have a warrant for your arrest on multiple counts of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and aggravated identity theft. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it immediately." The metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut around my brother's wrists echoed sharply in the quiet room. It was the sound of absolute finality. Amanda let out a piercing, horrific shriek. She backed away from her husband, pressing herself against the banquet table until the sharp edge pushed deep into her spine. She held her hands up in the air, frantically shaking her head as 2 state police officers quickly approached her. She sobbed wildly, begging them to listen to her, claiming she knew absolutely nothing about the stolen money or the forged mortgage documents. She threw the man she had sworn to love completely under the bus in a desperate, pathetic bid to save her own skin. The officers calmly informed her that she was being detained as an accessory to international flight and federal fraud. Then the true, crushing gravity of the situation finally hit the woman who had engineered this monster. My mother, Patricia, stood near the edge of the stage. Her luxurious burgundy sequined evening gown suddenly looked utterly ridiculous. The flawless illusion of her perfect wealthy family was being brutally dismantled right in front of the elite country club guests she had spent her entire adult life trying to impress. Her prominent friends were staring at her with naked, unapologetic revulsion. Her precious golden boy was standing in rigid metal restraints. Patricia looked down at the heavy stacks of paper I had left on the table. She looked at the forged equity line of credit that was going to cost her the only home she had ever owned. And then she looked directly at Tyler. "Tyler!" She wailed, her voice breaking into a ragged, devastating sob. "Tell them there has been a terrible mistake. Tell them you did not steal my house. Please tell me you did not try to abandon your own children." Tyler could not meet her gaze. He stared down at the polished hardwood floor, his face deathly pale and dripping with nervous sweat. He offered her absolutely nothing. No apology, no explanation. He just stood there trapped in the spectacular, complete failure of his own making. The reality broke Patricia completely. Her legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the floor, falling heavily to her knees, right in the middle of the scattered white rose petals that had fallen from the expensive centerpieces. She wrapped her arms tightly around her stomach, letting out a sound of pure, agonizing, endless grief. The untouchable golden pedestal she had placed her son on for 30 years had just shattered into worthless dust. The federal agents began to turn Tyler around to march him toward the exit doors. Patricia suddenly scrambled forward on her hands and knees. She reached out with trembling, frantic hands and grabbed the hem of my navy blue suit jacket. "Claire," she pleaded, her mascara running in dark, messy streaks down her face. Her voice was frantic and completely devoid of any remaining pride. "You have to stop them. You are an accountant. You know these corporate people. You know how to fix financial messes. Please tell them it was a misunderstanding. Please use your savings to bail him out. You have to save your brother." I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire childhood treating me like an unwanted burden. I thought about the morning she had stood in her pristine hallway, pointing her finger at my chest and calling me a miserable failure. I thought about how she had eagerly helped Tyler try to rip Emma and Leo away from the only safe place they had. I gently but firmly pulled my suit jacket out of her desperate grip. I looked her directly in the eyes, ensuring my voice was perfectly calm and loud enough for everyone in the quiet room to hear. "I told you this morning, Mom," I replied, my tone completely freezing over. "I am just a single woman with an unstable mental state. I cannot possibly help you." Patricia gasped as if I had physically struck her across the face. She slumped backward onto the floor, clutching her chest as the federal agents officially escorted her precious golden boy out of the grand ballroom in handcuffs. The loud murmurs of the remaining guests swelled into a chaotic symphony of shock and judgment. But I tuned all of it out. The financial retribution was complete, but my most important task of the night was just arriving. From the back of the ballroom, the heavy double doors opened one more time. The crowd parted naturally as two women walked briskly down the center aisle. The first was Sarah Hastings, the formidable family law attorney I had hired with my absolute last dollar. She wore a sharp charcoal suit and carried a thick leather binder. Walking right beside her was a woman wearing a state-issued identification badge representing the Department of Child Protective Services. They bypassed the whispering investors and walked directly up to the main banquet table. Sarah did not spare a single glance for the crying woman on the floor, or the panicked wife currently being read her Miranda rights by the state police. She walked straight to the lead investigator coordinating the scene. "I am attorney Sarah Hastings, representing Claire Adams," she announced, pulling a heavily stamped document from her binder. "I am presenting a Superior Court emergency guardianship mandate. My client has been granted full, immediate physical and legal custody of Emma and Leo Adams." The social worker stepped forward, confirming the absolute validity of the document to the police officers. She stated clearly that the children were currently safe asleep and legally secured at my personal residence under a strict protective order. She handed the official paperwork to the authorities, permanently shielding my niece and nephew from the terrifying foster care system and from the monstrous parents who had tried to abandon them. Amanda, who was currently in the process of being handcuffed, heard the social worker speak. She whipped her head around, her eyes wide with sudden, furious realization.
"You cannot take my kids,"
she screamed violently, pulling against the police officer restraining her wrists.
"You have no right."
Sarah turned to face my sister-in-law. Her expression was completely devoid of sympathy. "You purchased 2 one-way plane tickets to Belize for tomorrow morning. Mrs. Adams," she stated coldly, "you made absolutely zero provisions for your minor children. The state considers that premeditated abandonment. You lost your right to those children the second you packed your bags and chose a tropical beach over their safety." Amanda opened her mouth to argue, but no sound came out. The absolute undeniable truth of her own selfish choices had finally cornered her. The police officers firmly guided her toward the exit doors, following the exact path her husband had just taken. A profound, massive sense of peace washed over my entire body. I looked around the ruined banquet hall at the shattered remnants of my abusive family. For 32 years, I had allowed these people to make me feel small, invisible, and worthless. I had believed their cruel lies about my value. But standing there watching justice finally take its rightful course, I realized I was never the weak one. I was the solid, unshakable foundation they had all been blindly standing on. If you are watching this, and you have ever been the scapegoat of your own family, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You do not have to accept the terrible role they assign to you. You do not have to endure their cruelty just because you share the same blood. Setting a strict boundary is not an act of betrayal. It is a necessary act of survival. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment telling me exactly where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. I read every single one. Remember that your absolute true worth is not determined by the people who constantly refuse to see it. Until next time, take care of yourself. You truly deserve it. The changing of the seasons has always felt like a quiet miracle to me, but this year the arrival of spring carried a weight I had never experienced before. 6 months have passed since that freezing November night when the heavy oak doors of the country club swung open, and my entire life shifted on its axis. Today, the morning sun is pouring through the large bay windows of my living room, casting long, warm shadows across the hardwood floor. There is no ice on the glass. There is no frantic knocking at the door. There is only the soft, comforting sound of cartoons playing on the television and the gentle breathing of two safe, happy children. I sit at my kitchen table holding a mug of hot coffee, letting the steam rise against my face as I trace the unbelievable path that led us here. The dust has finally settled from the explosion that leveled my family, and the landscape left behind is completely unrecognizable from the one I inhabited just half a year ago. The justice system is notoriously slow, but when presented with an airtight mountain of federal evidence, the wheels can turn with brutal, relentless efficiency. 2 weeks ago, I sat in the polished wooden pews of a federal courthouse and watched the final chapter of my brother Tyler close permanently. He did not look like the golden boy of the Addams family anymore. The custom-tailored tuxedos and the arrogant, self-assured smirk had been completely stripped away. He was wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, his wrists secured by heavy metal chains that clinked loudly every time he shifted his weight. His hair was thinning, his posture was slumped, and the absolute reality of his situation had carved deep, heavy lines into his face. The federal judge did not offer him a single ounce of the leniency he had coasted on his entire life. When the gavel finally fell, the sound echoed like thunder through the silent courtroom. Tyler was sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary, without the possibility of early parole for massive corporate fraud, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. There was no offshore account waiting to save him. The federal authorities had moved with lightning speed on the night of the anniversary party, freezing the Cayman Island trusts and seizing every single digital asset Tyler had tried to hide. He had gambled his career, his freedom, and his own children on a rigged game, and he had lost absolutely everything. I watched him being led out a side door by 2 armed bailiffs. He turned his head and looked at me one last time just before he disappeared into the holding corridor. There was no hatred left in his eyes, just a vast, hollow emptiness. Amanda faced a very different kind of reckoning, but one that was equally devastating for a woman who had built her entire identity on social status and wealthy appearances. Because she had aggressively cooperated with the federal prosecutors, throwing Tyler completely under the bus from the very first night she managed to avoid a lengthy prison sentence. She accepted a plea deal admitting her guilt as an accessory to fraud and child abandonment, and she walked away with a suspended sentence and 5 years of strict probation. But staying out of a prison cell did not mean Amanda kept her life. The public scandal of the country club arrest had been front-page news in local business journals and social circles. Her wealthy, prominent parents, who had always fiercely protected their family reputation, were completely horrified by the undeniable proof of her premeditated child abandonment. The very idea that their daughter had packed designer luggage for a tropical escape while leaving her young children to become wards of the state was a bridge too far even for them. They formally completely disowned her. They cut off her access to family trust funds, revoked her credit cards, and publicly distanced themselves from the criminal fallout. Amanda's high society friends, the same women who had air-kissed her cheeks and admired her diamond rings, instantly vanished, treating her name like a highly contagious disease. I heard through the legal grapevine that she is currently living in a cheap motel, working a minimum wage retail job, and completing her mandated community service hours. She traded her children for a fantasy of wealth, and she ended up with absolutely nothing. And then there is Patricia. My mother, the woman who had spent 30 years cultivating an image of flawless suburban perfection, was forced to watch her entire reality dissolve into ash. The bank moved forward with the foreclosure on her beautiful white colonial house exactly as the fraudulent loan documents dictated. She had absolutely no legal recourse. Tyler had taken the money and the debt was legally attached to the property. I was not there the day the bank sent the moving crew to clear out the house, but I can only imagine the profound humiliation she must have felt watching 30 years of carefully curated furniture and expensive decorations being hauled out onto the front lawn. With no savings to fall back on, and her credit completely destroyed by association, she was forced to move into a small, dilapidated one-bedroom apartment on the far industrial side of town. The paint is peeling, the heating is unreliable, and the sprawling manicured lawn she used to brag about has been replaced by a view of a noisy commercial parking lot. Every single Sunday afternoon, right around 3 o'clock, my cell phone rings. It is always Patricia. She leaves long, tearful voicemails filling the digital space with endless apologies and desperate pleas for reconciliation. She cries about how much she misses Emma and Leo. She talks about how she was blinded by her love for Tyler, and how she never truly understood the monster he had become until it was too late. She begs me to let her visit, to let her be a part of our new family, to let her make up for all the terrible things she said and did. I listened to every voicemail completely stone-faced, and then I pressed delete. I have forgiven my mother, but I have done it entirely for my own peace of mind. I do not carry the heavy toxic weight of anger or resentment anymore, because holding on to those feelings would only poison the beautiful life I am building now. I forgive her for being a flawed, terrified woman who chose the wrong child to blindly support. But forgiveness does not mean access. Forgiveness does not mean I am obligated to open my front door and allow her toxic, chaotic energy back into the sanctuary I have created. I will never forget the way she stood in her hallway, defending a man who had left her grandchildren freezing in the snow. I will never forget the absolute disgust in her voice when she called me a pathetic disappointment. I have drawn a permanent solid line in the sand, and I will not let her cross it ever again. Boundaries are not acts of cruelty, they are acts of preservation. And my primary duty now is to preserve the safety and happiness of the 2 children sitting in my living room. My professional life experienced a resurrection that still feels entirely surreal. 2 days after the country club raid, Mr. Davis, the chief executive officer who had fired me over the phone, called me back into his office. The corporate atmosphere was entirely different. The federal auditors had finished their comprehensive review of the logistics company ledgers, and they had delivered a sobering conclusion. If I had not independently tracked down the phantom vendor accounts and secured the encrypted data on the flash drive, the entire company might have faced total financial ruin within another 6 months. Mr. Davis did not just offer me my old job back. He sat across his massive mahogany desk, looked me directly in the eyes, and formally apologized for doubting my integrity. He told me that my meticulous attention to detail, my forensic accounting skills, and my absolute refusal to back down under immense pressure were exactly the qualities his executive team desperately needed. He offered me the position of chief financial officer. It came with a massive corner office, a dedicated staff, and a salary that was more than double what I had been making as a simple payroll manager. I signed the contract that very same afternoon. The incredible irony of the situation is not lost on me. Tyler had engineered my firing because he believed destroying my career was the easiest way to silence me. Instead, his calculated betrayal handed me the exact key I needed to unlock my own ultimate success. I now run the entire financial division of the company he tried to destroy. I have security, stability, and the financial power to give my niece and nephew the beautiful life they deserve. And Emma and Leo are truly the center of my new universe. The legal process was remarkably smooth thanks to the brilliant aggressive work of Sarah Hastings. Because Tyler was incarcerated, and Amanda had a felony conviction tied directly to child abandonment, the family court judge permanently revoked their parental rights. I officially legally adopted Emma and Leo 3 months ago. The trauma of that freezing winter morning took time to heal. For the first few weeks, Leo would wake up crying in the middle of the night, terrified that he was about to be pushed out the door. Emma would constantly check the locks on the windows and quietly ask if we had enough money to buy groceries. But children are incredibly resilient when you plant them in safe soil and water them with consistent, unconditional love. Slowly, the fear began to melt away. The dark circles faded from under their eyes. The cautious, anxious silence they had learned in Tyler's house was replaced by genuine, loud laughter. We baked cookies on Saturday mornings, making a spectacular mess of the kitchen without anyone ever yelling about the flour on the floor. We read stories in the evenings wrapped in the same fleece blankets that once warmed them on my sofa. But now they represent comfort instead of emergency triage. They are thriving in their new schools, making friends, and finally learning what it feels like to simply be children without the heavy, suffocating burden of maintaining a perfect family image. They know they are safe. They know they are loved perfectly, exactly as they are. And they know with absolute certainty that they will never, ever have to run away on a freezing winter night again. I look back at the chaotic, terrifying journey of the past 6 months, and I realize something incredibly profound. That terrible November morning when the front door slammed shut and I was left standing in my hallway completely unemployed and financially terrified felt like the absolute end of the world. It felt like Tyler had won, like the cruelty of my family had finally completely destroyed me. But hitting rock bottom is sometimes the only way you can find a solid foundation to push off from. By choosing to prioritize the safety of 2 freezing, terrified children over my own corporate survival, I inadvertently grasped the thread that unraveled Tyler's entire criminal empire. By refusing to be the silent scapegoat any longer, I found my own voice. I stopped shrinking myself to fit into a family dynamic that only valued me when I was convenient or useful. I learned that true family is not defined by shared blood or automatic obligations. True family is built on respect, consistency, and the people who show up for you when the night is dark and the wind is howling. If you have stayed with me through this entire story, I want you to take away one incredibly vital lesson. If you have spent your life being the reliable one, the quiet one, the one who sacrifices your own peace to constantly clean up the messes of a toxic family, it is time to stop. You do not have to accept the role they assign to you. You do not have to keep buying their approval with your own suffering. Love that requires you to be small, invisible, or constantly forgiving of abuse is not love at all. It is exploitation disguised as obligation. Setting strict, unyielding boundaries is not a betrayal of your family. It is a necessary, beautiful declaration of your own self-worth. You have the absolute right to protect your peace, to defend your hard-earned life, and to leave the people who continually hurt you exactly where they belong in the past. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If you found any comfort, validation, or strength in what I have shared, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps these stories reach the people who desperately need to hear them. And please drop a comment below, letting me know where in the world you are watching from, and what time it is there right now. I read every single one of your comments, and I truly cherish connecting with this community. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family situation to save yourself? How did you find the courage to finally say enough? Share your journey in the comments because your survival story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Until next time, please take care of yourself, protect your peace, and remember that your worth is absolute. You deserve to be surrounded by light, and you have the power to create it. The house is incredibly quiet tonight, but it is a beautiful and profoundly healing kind of quiet. Emma and Leo are fast asleep down the hall in their own warm beds, surrounded by nightlights and soft blankets. I am sitting alone on my back porch, wrapped in a thick sweater, watching the wind rustle through the trees in my backyard. Looking up at the clear night sky, I finally have the time and the emotional space to process everything that has happened to me over the past 32 years. For the first few months after the arrests and the courtroom battles, I operated entirely on adrenaline. I was so focused on securing physical custody of the children, fighting the legal motions, and managing my new role as a chief financial officer that I did not have a single moment to stop and breathe. But as the dust settled and the massive changes in my life became my new normal, I realized I had a monumental amount of emotional unpacking to do. I started seeing a trauma specialist twice a week. I had to learn how to dismantle the invisible psychological prison my family had carefully built around me since the day I was born. Through therapy, I finally learned the professional terminology for the nightmare I had lived through. I learned about family gaslighting. For 3 decades, my mother and my brother had systematically manipulated my sense of reality. Whenever I brought up a valid concern or pointed out an obvious unfairness, I was immediately told that I was being overly sensitive. I was told that my memory was faulty, or that I was simply inventing drama to get attention. Gaslighting is an incredibly insidious form of emotional violence because it does not leave physical bruises. It leaves you constantly doubting your own sanity. It makes you feel like you are walking on a floor that is constantly shifting beneath your feet. Patricia and Tyler used gaslighting as their primary weapon to keep me confused, isolated, and entirely compliant. I also learned about the concept of the family scapegoat. In highly toxic and narcissistic family systems, there is almost always a golden child and a scapegoat. Tyler was the golden child. He could do absolutely no wrong in my mother's eyes. His failures were always blamed on external circumstances or bad luck. His cruelties were dismissed as simple misunderstandings. But a toxic family system requires a shock absorber. They need a designated villain to carry the heavy burden of the family dysfunction, so the golden child can remain perfectly clean. I was nominated for the role of the scapegoat before I even knew how to speak. Every time Tyler made a mess, I was the one expected to quietly clean it up. Every time my mother felt inadequate, she projected her bitter insecurities directly onto me. They trained me to believe that my only value in this world was tied to my ability to endure their abuse without ever complaining. They needed me to be small, invisible, and desperately eager to please them, so they could maintain their own comfortable illusions of superiority. Coming to terms with this reality was the most painful part of my healing journey. Society constantly pushes a very specific narrative about family. We are told from a very young age that blood is thicker than water. We are conditioned to believe that family is everything and that you must always forgive the people who share your genetic makeup. The harsh and terrifying truth is that blood relatives are sometimes the exact people who are most willing to exploit your kindness with absolute cruelty. The people who share your last name are often the ones who know exactly where your deepest vulnerabilities lie because they are the ones who installed those buttons in the first place. Tyler knew that my immense love for his children was my only weakness. He weaponized my empathy against me without a single second of hesitation. Patricia knew that I carried a desperate lifelong craving for her maternal approval. She weaponized her affection, withholding it completely and using it as a carrot on a stick to keep me obedient. It is a bitter, devastating pill to swallow when you realize that the people who are supposed to protect you are actually the predators you need protection from. You spend your entire life believing that if you just give a little more, if you just sacrifice a little harder, they will finally wake up and realize your worth. You think that your unconditional love will eventually be the magic cure that fixes their broken hearts. But you cannot buy love from people who only see you as a tool. I spent 28 years trying to purchase my mother's affection with my unwavering loyalty. I paid her bills. I showed up to her events. I smiled through her insults, and I accepted her complete dismissal of my achievements. I thought I was being a good daughter, but to Patricia and Tyler, I was never a human being with feelings, dreams, and basic rights. I was simply an appliance. You do not love an appliance. You use it when it is convenient, you plug it in when you need something from it, and you completely ignore it when you are done. And if the appliance ever stops working, you simply kick it to the curb and blame it for being defective. Understanding this has set me completely free. I look back on that freezing November morning when my entire world seemed to be collapsing into a dark abyss. Losing my job and having my home invaded by Tyler's engineered crisis felt like the absolute end of my life. But I see now that it was actually a spectacular beginning. By choosing to step up and protect Emma and Leo, I inadvertently grasped the single loose thread that unraveled my brother's entire criminal empire. I stopped playing the role of the obedient scapegoat. I finally stood up straight, looked the monsters in the eye, and refused to carry their toxic secrets anymore. I want to share a vital truth with anyone who might be listening to my story today. Your kindness is not a weakness. For so many years I believed that my soft heart and my deep empathy were massive character flaws. I thought my inability to be as ruthless as my brother made me inherently inferior. But my empathy is exactly what saved 2 innocent children from being permanently abandoned to the cold machinery of the state foster care system. My kindness gave them a warm, safe home where they can finally sleep through the night without fear. True strength is not about how loudly you can shout or how ruthlessly you can destroy others. True strength is having the power to protect the vulnerable, even when your own hands are shaking. Setting strict boundaries is not a betrayal of your family. It is an absolute requirement for your own survival. Putting a heavy lock on your front door to keep a thief out of your house makes logical sense to everyone. We must learn to apply that exact same logic to our emotional homes. When you distance yourself from a toxic parent or a manipulative sibling, you are not acting out of malice. You are simply refusing to let emotional thieves continue to rob you of your joy, your peace, and your sanity. Do not ever let anyone use the concept of family loyalty to guilt you into tolerating constant abuse. I have built a beautiful new life from the ashes of the old one. I am succeeding in a career that challenges and fulfills me. I am raising two incredible, resilient children who remind me every single day that cycle breaking is possible. We do not have a perfect life, but we have a peaceful one, and peace is the greatest luxury a person can ever possess. I do not answer my mother's desperate phone calls. I do not read the occasional letters she attempts to send through her neighbors. I have forgiven her in my heart, so that I do not have to carry the poison of resentment, but I will never allow her to cross my threshold again. The door is permanently closed, and the lock is firmly secured. I know that my journey is not unique. I know there are thousands of people quietly enduring the exact same agonizing dynamics in their own homes. We are taught to suffer in silence, to keep the family secrets buried deep in the backyard, and to always protect the golden children, no matter the cost to our own souls. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. Sharing this has been incredibly therapeutic for me, and I hope my words have offered some comfort or validation to those who need it. If you have ever been taken advantage of by a loved one, or had to find the immense courage to stand up for your boundaries, please comment below. I want to hear your stories of survival and strength. Please tell me where you are watching this video from, and at what time it is there. Let me know that I am not speaking into an empty void. And please do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to support me in sharing more stories of seeking justice and finding freedom like this one. We build our strength by sharing our truths with one another. Goodbye for now, and I hope to see you again very soon.